Welcome to Between the Reads, a podcast about Black books. I'm your host, Audra Russell. Welcome to Season 3. We've made it to 2022, and there are so many great new things happening this year with the podcast, and I can't do it without your support. So please consider heading over to patreon.com/betweenthereads to join. Are you ready, Boos and Bros? Then sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Lisa Stringfellow writes middle-grade fiction and has a not-so-secret fondness for fantasy with a dark twist. Her debut fantasy, A Comb of Wishes, will be published on February 8th, 2022 by HarperCollins Quilltree Books. It was selected as an ABA Indies Introduced title for Winter-Spring 2022, and Lisa received the inaugural Quelly Color of Children's Literature Manuscript Award in 2019 for the novel manuscript. Her work often reflects her West Indian and Black Southern heritage. Lisa is a middle school teacher and lives in Boston, Massachusetts with her children and 2 bossy cats. Lisa, welcome to Between the Reads.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Well, let's get right to it. Tell us what A Comb of Wishes is all about.
So, A Comb of Wishes is a middle grade fantasy, and it's about a girl who is 12 years old. Her name is Keela, and she has been struggling after the death of her mother, and really just not kind of losing her place in the world. And so she goes to the beach and she's looking for sea glass, which is something that she used to do for her with her mom. And she hears a mysterious sound that seems to call to her, and she follows it into a coral cave and finds a box. And when she takes that box and opens it later, it opens a connection to a dangerous mermaid named Ophidia, who offers her a wish in exchange for her box. Mm-hmm. And there's only one thing Keela wants more than anything, and it's to have her mom back. Mm-hmm. So that is the premise of the story.
And that's what starts it all. That one wish. So where did the idea for the book come from?
A couple of different places. I'm a classroom teacher, and one of the things that I love to do with my students is to read, obviously, with them. And I also started to write with them back about 8 or 9 years ago. There's a annual challenge called NaNoWriMo, and it's to write a novel in 30 days. Right. And so my students were doing that with the Young Writers Program, and I said to them I would write with them. So I was thinking about what my story would be about, and I had read a book called The Tale of Emily Winsnap, which is about a girl who finds out that she's part mermaid. So I thought, ooh, a mermaid would be fun. And I'd also read a book, Neil Gaiman's Coraline, which I love his work. And that particular book, just has such a, there's a girl by herself and, exploring, and but it kind of has like a little bit of a spooky vibe. So those 2 ideas kind of came together in my head, and I pictured, I think, the mermaid's character first, with that premise in mind. So Ophidia is the mermaid. So that's kind of where it started for me. Okay.
And now in your notes in the book, in the back, you said that the girl in the book is both Keela and you. Mm-hmm. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So my heritage is, my mom is from Alabama, so I have that Southern heritage, and my dad is from Barbados, and I grew up here in New England, but was very close to my family on both sides, and the Boston area is where my dad's family lived. So all around me growing up, I was surrounded by, the food and the culture and the music and the dialect, West Indian accents. And so that part was very much just, prominent in my life. And I feel like when I was a child, I think I've said, I was a reader, voracious reader, and I loved to read all sorts of books, but I love fantasies in particular. And I read all sorts of things, A Wrinkle in Time, The Chronicles of Narnia, but I never really saw many characters that looked like me or sounded like me. And so I think Keela comes from, the child that I was a little bit, that I wanted to see these stories.
Mm,
I also was surrounded, like she was, by a very loving family of people who wanted to kind of, just make sure she was okay and take care of her. And I think those things
mhm.
were all part of what I channeled into her character.
Okay, so you kind of wrote the book that you wanted to see when you were a kid.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, Crick Crack. The story is put on you. And you explained what this was in the book, but I'd like for you to explain that to our readers because there's another book I haven't read it yet, but the title is actually Crick Crack and it's Edwidge Danticat. I think I'm saying her name right.
Yes,
And I
yes.
never knew what that meant. So explain to our readers what that means.
So, in that book is the short story anthology that kind of calls on a lot of, like, that author's also West Indian. And
Mm-hmm.
Crick Crack, in my book, when I was trying to decide how to tell the story, I really, the oral storytelling traditions of the Caribbean really came to the front. And as I was thinking about telling a story about, magical creatures, there's a girl who meets a mermaid. That folklore quality, oral storytelling came very much to my mind. And in many places in West Africa that travel to the Caribbean, there's a call and a response interaction that goes on between the storyteller and the audience.
Mm-hmm.
So Crick Crack is one of those storytelling frames that's used. And so the storyteller would start off with, I say crick, and the audience would say crack. And the tradition is how loudly and enthusiastically people respond lets the storyteller know how much the people want to hear the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's many parts of the traditions in the islands where they may use that phrase or they may use other sayings, and it's all part of kind of their interaction between the storyteller and the people listening. And in my story, the chapters that are told in Ophidio's point of view
Yes.
also that
Mm-hmm.
phrase crick crack, and they
Mm-hmm.
end with the same crick crack, but then it changes slightly to the story is put on you.
Mm-hmm.
And that connects to, in some storytelling traditions that are Yoruban, with the idea of story being in the mind of the hearer. And
Mm-hmm.
so once the story is told, it's left to the person who has listened to it to decide what it means to them and what they take away from it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I use that just to kind of give celebration and you know a nod to those traditions that were so important and that still continue today. And
Mm-hmm.
then I think because I use them on in Ophidio's chapters, it also adds to that element of storytelling,
Mm.
that you kind of get that folktale quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that was going to be my next question was that you included that in the chapters where we were seeing things from Ophidio's point of view. I thought that was really kind of neat. So you did that just to kind
Yeah,
of shift people's view to let them know, okay, this is Ophidio's story kind of thing.
it is. And but the very last line of the book is in Keela's point of view, and
Mm-hmm.
it ends with the same frame of
Mm-hmm.
crick crack, the story is put on you. And
Mm-hmm.
so that kind of is a nod to, that the whole thing is now for the people who've read the book to think about
Mm-hmm.
what they want to take away from it.
Right. Absolutely. Now, there is a small passage in the beginning of chapter 23 that I just want to read. And then I'd like for
Hmm.
you to tell me how you came up with the idea because I thought this was really,
Sure.
really interesting. So, Crick Crack, this is a story. The storm that boiled within Ophidia rolled into the sea. Rain slapped the land in frustration. Her tail thrashed, and she tried not to think about her fading life. Sea folk didn't carry their souls like common belongings, nor cram them between flesh and bone. They were too precious for that. Carved from the bones of a creature long dead, the comb, her soul cage, had been a gift of friendship, one that proved false. Magic allowed her to trap the soul she had taken inside. Like all sea folk, she had hidden hers, and in dark and slow-moving places, she had kept it for centuries, and she had survived. I thought that was really interesting because this comb is really when all the trouble begins. Now, how did you come
Mhm.
up with the concept? Was that something you read, or how did you come up with that concept of putting the soul in the comb?
Yeah, that's actually part of mermaid lore. So
Really?
one of the things that I really enjoyed when I was working on the story was to start reading lots of fairy tales and folk tales from all over the world that I could find about mermaids, as
Hmm.
well as looking to see where the traditions of mermaids, because you know our view of some characters, some mythical creatures is very Eurocentric, and so
Hmm.
I think most people imagine mermaids as, these light skinned, fair haired creatures and
Hmm.
just saw kind of like that, the Little Mermaid type view.
Hmm.
But there are mermaids all over the world. But a couple of things. So I think the first story many people think of with the Little Mermaid is the Hans Christian Andersen version.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the Disney version is very different than the original version. If you read that, in
Hmm.
that version, you find out that mermaids do not have souls, and it's when they die, they're gone. And so version of the story, she, is in love with the prince, and he falls in love with someone else, and she's told by the sea witch um, if she kills the prince, that she'll be able to have a tail again and return to her people,
Hmm.
and she can't do it.
Hmm.
And so she fades away to sea foam.
Hmm.
In another version of the story, there's these spirits of the air that come and at the end say, she's proven herself to be a good, creature, and that, if she continues to do good deeds, then, she'll have a soul.
Hmm.
Um, Other mythology with mermaids, mermaids are seen as very much predatory creatures. And
Hmm.
so there are these stories of sailors falling into water, and the mermaids kind of taking their soul and putting them literally in these cages.
Hmm.
There's some stories from different parts of the world so that's where I got that, the idea of kind of the
Okay.
soul cage, and the 300 years, again, that came from the Anderson myth as well. So all sorts of stories. I mean, even the artifacts that mermaids carry with them, the things like mirrors and combs, pop up in different cultures and different mythologies,
Hmm.
from different places around the world.
Okay. Now, there's a link, and we won't say what it is, between Ophidia and Keela and her mother and the comb. Did you always know that that would be a part of the story, or did that just kind of develop as you were writing it?
Developed as I was writing. As I mentioned, Ophidio's character was very much clear to me at the beginning of the story,
Hmm.
and as I started imagining Keela, and I started to think about, if a child was given a wish, what would they wish for? What would be something really big that they'd wish for? And I imagined, well, if she had lost something, if she lost somebody she loved, so many of us would want the same thing, to have that person.
Hmm.
So then, as I was thinking about her mother's character, um, that's where I began to think about, like, her mother being a storyteller as well, and a researcher as well. And so I had to make connections between the past and the present.
Hmm.
And so all of those things, the fact that she has her mother, who's more of a little bit more of an anthropologist and someone who studies storytelling, but from a little bit of a more scholarly point of view, and wanting to preserve these stories of the past.
Hmm.
And then she also has her friend's grandmother, Miss Innes, who is an active storyteller and
Hmm.
tells stories to entertain people,
Yeah.
in front of her shop.
Hmm.
All of those things kind of connect. But I felt like having that connection between Keela and Ophidia was important, but they have a connection just in the in their interactions because they both are grieving in different ways. And
Right.
so their reactions are different. I think
Mhm.
Ophidia's anger and turned to bitterness,
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
Keela's turned to kind of pulling away from the people who loved her. And in
Mhm.
the end, they both kind of get a chance at redemption and
Mhm.
forgiveness with each other.
Yeah, because they both kind of have things that they're misunderstanding. With Ophidia, she thinks that she's been betrayed, and then some things kind of get ironed out. And with Keela, she thinks that because her mother's gone, like her whole world is gone, and she starts to realize as things go on that yes, her mother's gone, and that's a deep void, but there are still other people there who very much love her and who she loves, who, she still has to embrace. And she kind of forgets that. So I think it was really beautiful the way you kind of brought them both kind of full circle in the story. I really
Thank
like
you.
that. Hmm.
Thank you.
So you showed the beauty of relationships between all ages, which is something else that I really loved in this book. The relationships between young kids like Keela and Lissy, and then between young kids and their parents, like you showed the relationship between Keela and her dad, and Keela and Miss Innes. And then, you showed the relationship between young kids and the elderly. Was this at all influenced by your West Indian heritage?
I think so because I grew up in a family, and really both sides of my family, I could say, were this way, where things were very intergenerational. So I had my parents and my brother that I lived with, but like I spent, so much time at my grandparents' house. I laugh because one of the things that I remember from elementary school was a friend asking me my phone number
Hmm.
so they could call. And I didn't know my home phone number, but I knew my grandmother's. I spent so much time there. So I gave them my grandmother's phone number. And I remember my grandmother telling me, "It's like, somebody called for you." and I was like, "Oh, that was my friend."
Uh-huh.
So just, having aunts and uncles and cousins, everybody's a cousin, you don't even worry about exactly how they're cousin, you just call them that.
Hmm.
um, it just is part of the community and just celebrating moments together, coming together at the holidays, coming
Hmm.
together at special occasions. So I think it was just part of how I grew up. I miss that and I recalled that. I've since I lived away from home for a long time after I moved away to teach in a different state, and I came
Hmm.
back home, and just to reconnect with family, I think was so important. So I wanted to give that to Keela as well.
Okay. Now, you also dealt with loss in this book in a very endearing and kind of gentle way. And you stated in your notes in the back of the book that, COVID had an impact on this and how you wrote this. Why was that important to share with your readers?
I think because we're in a time period and, it takes so long to publish a book. So when, the book comes out next week, it'll be, almost 2 years, almost three since it was acquired. And when I wrote the author's note, it was in um, early 2021.
Hmm.
Um, it, I think so many people have had different ways, whether loss of a loved one through the pandemic,
Hmm.
um, the isolation that people have felt being, having to stay home more. I had just lost my dad, who was an important influence for me in thinking
Hmm.
about, some of the characters in the book that, he inspired me with that, right before the pandemic started. And so I was thinking a
Hmm.
lot about those things
Hmm.
as a teacher as well. I've had students who've gone through deep losses, and I think about wanting to have those examples for them to see, how, they can see on the page a kid like them who's maybe experienced something similar to how they're feeling, but to
Right.
also see that, there's a process that you can go through, and that things may feel really, really sad as you're going through it. But to remember, I think one of the lessons that Keela learns is to open up to the people around her and not push them away. That her friend Lissy is ready to be there again for her. If she is just willing kind of to take her hand and accept her again. And I just think that that's an important message for kids and parents, like to be able to talk about grief as a natural process and how to support one another when we're facing it.
Absolutely. Now, you started the book in 2013. So that's a considerable gap between then and now. Were you always writing? Did you put it down? Tell us about that journey from then to now and what made this the right time to publish.
Yeah, it took a while because one, publishing is slow, as I've mentioned,
Right.
But I was a baby writer, and I as a debut, I still feel like there's so much for me to learn. But when I started that draft, as I mentioned, I wrote with my students and doing the NaNoWriMo challenge. I won NaNoWriMo. So that year was I got to 50,000 words, and that was exciting, but the book wasn't done. So I kept working after that. And I think it was the spring of 2014 that I actually finished. I came up with how the story should end. That was something actually I struggled with, the ending. And after that, I realized that there was a lot that I needed to study and learn. And so I started looking for people who could, teach me. I think as a teacher, I definitely understood books and literacy from the lens of the reader and teaching them. But from the lens of the writer, there was the opposite side of the craft that I still needed to educate myself about. So I joined critique groups, people who could read with me and give me their feedback. I sought out mentorships, and I was accepted to two wonderful the author mentor match. I was in round 2, so early on. And then I also was in a mentorship called Writing in the Margins for marginalized writers. And I had great published authors who read the manuscript, gave me feedback on voice, gave me feedback on pacing and tension. And then they helped me query it once I got through working with it with both of them. And then I was able to send it out, and I was offered representation in 2018 by my agent, who's at Writer's House, Lindsay Davis Auld. And we worked on it again for another 18 months before we sent it out.
Right.
So one thing I think writers who are starting out need to be aware of is that you always need revision never ends in some ways. Like you have to, I tell my students this, that, you have to get to a point where you stop, where you feel like, I've accomplished what I want to, but like, there's always things to correct. And they enjoy looking at published books and finding things like, oh, I think I found a typo or something in the book. And I'm like, yes, that happens. Even though many, many people have read it, something will still slip through.
Right.
So that was, we sent it out in 2019, and it went to auction. And I ended up deciding to work with Rosemary Bronson at HarperCollins Quiltry Books, which was wonderful. And then she and I revised a little bit more. So, it definitely, all of those people have helped me so much and helped the book, really focus on what the core of the story is and to make it what I wanted it to be.
And that's just encouragement for all my readers who might be aspiring writers out there. It may be years before, you finish that book, or things may happen and you may stop, you may pick it up, put it back down. I've heard all kinds of stories from writers out there. So, you just have to keep going. And especially if you're going to go the traditional route, you have to be patient once your book is accepted.
Absolutely.
Because it can be up to 18 months before your book actually makes it to print.
Right. And I also think, I was fortunate in that it's not the only manuscript I've written, but it was an early one that actually made it through to being acquired. But I know so many author friends who have books that they wrote that weren't the book that they debuted, but with, and maybe it was like the third book that they wrote that ended up
Hmm.
being their debut.
Right.
But what they'll say is that all of those books taught them and had a place in the process of them becoming a better writer. So
Mm-hmm.
all of it's so important.
Absolutely. Now, there seem to be a few books out there. There seems to be like a surge of books with black mermaids. You've got your book, A Comb of Wishes. You've got Skin of the Sea. You have Rise of the Jumbies. What's your take on why that may be happening now?
I am so thrilled that it's happening now, and I think it's you've named a couple of books, and there's a few others that I can think of, but I think we about the big picture
Mhm.
for so long. I think in publishing, like authors that are white, more mainstream, have
Mhm.
published stories about, vampire, about
Mhm.
witches. And those stories have not necessarily included those of us, who identify as people of color. And so now we're finally having those opportunities to tell those stories so that,
Right.
the kids who have been craving them will see them. I
Mhm.
think, trends in publishing change.
Right.
I don't think this is necessarily a trend, but I do think it's that publishers are now recognizing that by a more mainstream writer doesn't mean that um, writers that are BIPOC, that it's dead, or that it's
Right.
there's nothing new to say, because there's so many you know avenues that have not been explored yet. So I
Mhm.
I think that's great. I think I still think, though, that there's worth in the area of Black girls in
Oh,
fantasy.
absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I feel like I just can't wait to see what else will come out soon. So,
Yes. Yes. There I've seen a few books. It's starting to increase and I love it because when
yes,
I was a kid, I didn't see myself in any books other than maybe Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And that shows you how old I
yes,
am.
I know. Well,
And
I'm teaching that actually right now.
right. And see, the thing was, I loved the book when I was a kid because it was the only book where I really saw myself, but yet there was an aspect of it
Hmm.
I couldn't relate to because I didn't grow up
Exactly.
in that type of environment. But I also
Right.
did not know until just maybe 2 years ago that it was an entire series. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and she just published the last one, I think, in 2020. So now I have the whole series on my shelf. But when I was a kid, there were no books with me in them, you know?
No, and I remember too as a kid that, same thing. I read that book, and I read so many books like, Virginia Hamilton has,
Hmm.
all of these pioneers of Black children's literature.
Hmm.
But sometimes in the libraries, I only saw, either historical fiction or
Hmm.
maybe some realistic stories, and I didn't
Hmm.
see those fantasies. And so that's
Right.
why I'm so happy that these books are starting to come out.
Absolutely. So, do you have plans to write more books?
I do. I so my book deal was a two-book deal, which I was excited about. So
Okay.
I'm working on my second book. It's another standalone fantasy, and I can kind of say it's I haven't turned the manuscript in yet, so it's still working on it, but it should hopefully come out in 2023.
Okay.
Um, got more of that fairy tale, calling on folklore and fairy tale a little bit.
Okay.
It's more of a princess in a tower type of story with some
Mhm.
West African influences. So
Oh.
I'm excited to
Is
get that
there a
out in the world eventually.
title? Do we have a working title we can share?
Yes, I do have a working title, but I won't share it now because
Okay.
books titles change.
Right.
So my Comb of Wishes was actually until last year had a different title.
Okay.
So things are never set in stone until the publisher decides.
Right, right, exactly. Okay, fair enough. So, where can readers find your books?
So A Comb of Wishes comes out on this coming Tuesday, February 8th. It'll be available
Yay.
at all places. Everywhere books are sold. I would highly, recommend checking out the indie bookstores, going to sites like bookshop.org, and you can order either from a local bookstore or still get it sent to you, but it kind of helps support the indie stores. And I have a website also, lisastringfellow.com, where readers can find out more about what's going on, what events I'm doing, and just keep track of the news, the book news. And I'm also online at Twitter, at Engage Readers on Twitter and Instagram.
Okay. And, well, you just said it, but you can say it again. Where can we find you on social media?
My handle is at Engage Readers on both Twitter and Instagram.
All righty. Well, we have come to the end of our show, and I want to thank you so much for sharing your time and your talents with us today. Lisa, I truly enjoyed your book, A Comb of Wishes, and I hope everybody will run and get it on Tuesday. It's a great book.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. At Booze and Bros, you know how I do at the end of every show. I give you a quote, and today's comes from Derek Walcott, a St. Lucian poet and playwright. And he said very simply, "I consider the sound of the sea to be part of my body." Until next time, y'all, you know what to do. Grab a book and read. And I'm out. Thanks for lending me your ear today. If you enjoyed this content, please head over to betweenthereads.com and leave a rating for the show. While you're there, consider supporting this independent podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/betweenthereads. Join us next week for another great episode.